So my name is David Mills. Welcome. This is a Centre for Global Higher Education hybrid webinar, and today it's a great pleasure to be welcoming Anke from the University of Sussex, and she'll be talking about creative critical pedagogies for rethinking higher education. As always, we'll be talking for about half an hour, and then there'll be a chance for you all to ask questions, and we're looking forward very much to this really interesting talk. So with that, please let me know if you have any problems with the chat function or with the sound. I'll hand over to Anke.
Yes, thank you so much. Welcome everybody, really nice to see you in the room. Online, I just want to say thank you, David, for inviting me. First of all, giving me the pleasure of having this lovely Viva this morning, a dissertation on student activism, which directly relates to my own research, as I will show. And then also giving me the opportunity to speak to you today about my own research. So, I think my first slide, So I'm currently a professor of anthropology and global development at the University of Sussex. And I'm saying that I'm not an education person. I don't have a PhD, so there might be slightly less theory in this talk. I very much am doing this work, giving this talk as a long-term educator in the field of especially international development. So I've been teaching over 20 years now in anthropology, international development, in a variety of different contexts, in the US, in New Zealand, as well as now in the UK for 10 years. I've been at Sussex for 10 years. And in the field of international development, and I'll come to that, what it is, but I've often had a very similar reaction. All the programs where I've worked have a very critical approach to international development, right? The international development system, the way it is very kind of neoliberal and market-driven, and the way it often doesn't work and produces more inequitable outcomes. And this criticality is really important in our teaching, so getting our students to interrogate the shortcomings of international development. And students really appreciate that. But at the same time, there's always been a second reaction to this kind of critical teaching, and this is, I understand why it's important for me to learn about these issues, why it's important for me to get that critical understanding, but what am I now going to do with this knowledge? Because I came to international development partly because I want to bring about change in the world, and I thought international development is a way to do this, and all I'm hearing is it's not working. There's something really wrong with the system, and it's making me quite disillusioned, quite cynical, and indeed quite hopeless about my studies, but also kind of my place in the wider world. And for me as an educator, getting this response very consistently, but also then through engaging with my colleagues, realizing that I'm not the only one, I started to think, what can I do about this? This is not good enough to have this reaction. And for me, the answer came to combine critical teaching, which is really, really important, with what I call kind of creativity, which is about fostering students' imagination, giving them creative skills, a creative mindset, giving them permission to be creative in their own work, in their learning, and through that, installing a sense of hope, a sense of critical hope, which is, I will explain what that means later. So it was very much in the field of international development, introducing them to alternatives to development. And there can be social movements, there can be activism, there can be grassroots development. I'll give some examples here. So what I will do in this talk is talk a little bit about kind of how this interest in creativity has played out in the research project I've undertaken, and there will also be lots of examples from my own teaching to illustrate how I've applied that in my own teaching, in my own pedagogical practice, but maybe also give you some ideas of how that might be relevant for you. So what I did is basically bringing critique and creativity together in what I call the critical creative pedagogy. And I undertook a 3-year research project act in my home department, the School of Global Studies at the University of Sussex. It consisted of interviews with about 30 students. I call them kind of student journey interviews because I interviewed them at the end of their studies, including for ethical reasons, but very much reflecting on their journey. I conducted interviews with a number of my colleagues. I did a review of the teaching material that we are having, so quite a systematic review. I went into my colleagues' classes to do in-class observations, but perhaps most importantly, I used my own classes as kind of an experimental space. So I did lots of exercises with my students, of course, explaining why I'm doing this, how this feeds into my research. So it was kind of a very mixed method a research project. I developed this, what I came to call a critical creative university, critical creative pedagogy, and the aim of this pedagogy to help students better understand the global challenges we are facing, but also to imagine alternative responses to them. And when I say alternative, I mean kind of non-mainstream, heterodox responses to some of these challenges. I also had a period of time where I did research at Bolivian universities. I'm a trained Latin Americanist, and for me to understand some of the debates, for example, around decolonizing, I wanted to also understand how this is seen outside the UK university. I realized that my site is a really small, a very particular place, so I did go to Bolivia, and I'll explain how some of those findings fed into my research. So I published a book, it came out in 2021. Futures, policy press, and I also have a website where I have a blog. Update my thinking, but there's also teaching resources on them. It's very much a companion piece to the work because the idea was to kind of write this as an invitation for others to take these ideas and experiment them in their own classrooms. So yes, a little bit of theory. So what were my pedagogical inspirations? And the first one is bell hooks, the idea that teaching is an invitation for students to transgress particular boundaries, kind of personal boundaries, institutional boundaries, but also the boundaries between the classroom, the university, and their life outside it. And I do believe, agree with her, that classroom is maybe not the most radical, but one of the most radical spaces in the academy, because through our encounter with students, through our educational practice, we bring forth the future in some way. Then Paulo Freire, his ideas of pedagogies of hope, right? His very kind of explicit reflections on hope almost as an ontological necessity, right? We can't really do what we do without a sense of hope. But also his reminder that doing this kind of critical pedagogy that he writes about demands courage and demands persistence. It's a long-term process. It's not something that happens overnight. And it needs personal courage on behalf of the educator, but it also needs courage on behalf of the students to engage with that kind of teaching. Gibbs and Graham, two kind of geographers, political economic geographers, who have wonderfully written about what kind of academic subjects we have to become to do this kind of research. They talk more about research, but I've applied their writing to teaching. And they talk about it as academic subjects of possibility, which doesn't come easy to us, because as academics, we are trained to be critical, we are trained to deconstruct, we are trained to take things apart without necessarily putting things back together again. And I saw their writing as cracks in the system and being active in them. They, as I said, they write around regimes on anticipation and how we engage with the future in the academy. And then last but not least, Arturo Escobar, a anthropologist slash development scholars who was part of the very critical thinking about development studies, post-development, but more recently has written about, again, about how we can think about alternatives, and especially pluriversal alternatives. He's from Colombia and draws a lot of social movements in his native Colombia. So again, there's another connection to Latin America here. So that's my pedagogical inspirations that are running through the book and through my work. And then the other thing, I wanted to just spend a little bit of time to talk about what I mean by creativity, especially academic creativity, because jumping here to the fourth point, creativity has become a real buzzword. Innovation has become a real buzzword within universities, where it's kind of often linked to kind of commercialization and a particular agenda, quite neoliberal agenda that universities are pursuing. Rob Pope has traced the emergence of this idea of market creativity to post-Second World War in the context of the Cold War, getting military superiority, growing kind of economic competitiveness. That's not the kind of creativity I'm talking about. So I went to Ken Robinson. Some of you might be familiar with his writings on kind of the ability to leap out what's familiar to us and what's familiar to the students, to make these connections to new areas, kind of sideways movements. Again, two UK scholars, Alison James and Stephen Prockway, who talk a lot about academic creativity, and they have this wonderful idea of moving away from the well-trodden to sniff out. So it's quite often quite subtle processes, these senses of possibility, and then moving beyond them. Another person you might be familiar with is Swan Burnett's writing on 5 forms of creativity, which have been really helpful. And it's the idea of that everybody, every student and every educator has this creative potential within them. And it's a matter of finding ways to encourage that and to develop that in our teaching. And the other thing, even though I have this picture here, right, the left brain and the right brain, we often think of this as kind of this split thing between critique and creativity, but they belong together. There is a continuum. You can't be critical without being creative in some ways, right? Like writing an academic article is an incredibly creative process, but you can't be creative without critically thinking about the creations you bring into being. So I see it very much as a continuum rather than two separate things. So that's just a little bit on what I mean by academic creativity. So what does this all add up to? Critical creative pedagogy, and as you can see here, actually with help from my husband Paul, we created this kind of the flower, the critical creative kind of a guiding star. We tried to put it in a kind of a visual format, but you see there's these 4 petals: whole person learning, the use of design and arts methods, praxis, and critical hope, that are kind of interwoven in this whole. And the interesting thing about this flower, it can be as small or as large as one wants it to be. So it can be a very small exercise we might be doing with our students for 10 minutes, non-assessed, or it could be a whole module or indeed a whole course being structured around these ideas. So these 4 strands, they're interwoven and they are scalable or expandable. And what I want to do now is just run through each of these petals, explain briefly what they are, and give some examples from my own teaching. Starting off with whole person learning, which is something that should be really obvious to us as educators, that when our students come into the classroom, right, they don't just bring their brains or their intellects, they bring bodies, they bring emotions, they bring experiences with them that often, especially in the social science teaching, which is kind of the area I'm really speaking to, we often forget, especially when it's, discussing papers, deconstructing arguments, and there's often very little room for that kind of whole person teaching. But I think it's really important to start with that. So this speaks to the importance of experiential knowledge. I always, experiential knowledge, experiential learning, I always talk to my students that I think the knowledge they bring into the classroom from their lives outside university, maybe where they're coming from, maybe their everyday experiences, are really valid sources of knowledge that I invite them to bring into the classroom. So there's it takes safe spaces. It takes actually quite a lot of thinking about structures for how to do that. And then there are a number of, so in each chapter of the book, I bring in a number of examples from myself and my colleagues where I find whole person learning taking place. And in terms of my own research, I teach a class on urban futures. It's a third-year specialist class for international development students. And Sussex, I don't know if you know, it's located next to Brighton. And by their final year of studies, pretty much everybody lives in Brighton. So I anchor a lot of my teaching in Brighton, because I said it's a space that you know well. We are discussing a lot of theories and ideas in class. How can we apply this to Brighton, right, as a space? And there's a process I put in place, because one of the things is students are not necessarily familiar with a more creative way of teaching. It certainly doesn't come through the education system in the UK, which is not about creativity at all, but they might also not be very comfortable with it. So I think one of the things I've learned is putting in place different steps. And in this particular class on urban futures, I start by inviting the students to keep a Brighton diary for a week. And I said, for 1 week, I want you to be really very reflexive and very explicit about yourselves as Brighton residents. So how do you spend your time? Where do you go? Who do you interact with? Where do you do your shopping? What places do you avoid, maybe? And keep kind of track of that. And then at the end of that week, create a story or an image, and I set up a Padlet where people can upload this. And this becomes the basis of a discussion of how we inhabit Brighton. And then the students come together to write a Brighton manifesto as an initial collective exercise for how could Brighton be made a more sustainable, more equitable city. And here's just kind of an example of a manifesto, some postings from students, and this actually goes a bit back, but it was during COVID that I really realized the importance of giving students space to also talk about their emotions and what they were missing during COVID and what they had lost. And this and that. Just really more recently, I've been working with a drama teacher actually it's a master's course on provocative pedagogies, and really doing embodied teaching with students, a very international group of students, and that's been really insightful to bring in other disciplines, in this case drama, to actually actively use the body. Is absolutely fascinating and very beautiful. So that's whole person learning. The second pedal relates to design and arts, and this is really about opening up imagination, opening up kind of the capacity to experiment and to empathize. Obviously the use of arts, be it poetry, be it literature, be it visual arts, does this, but I want to talk a little bit more about design, because that might be something that you're not so familiar with. And there's a number of concepts in design that I think that really lend themselves. One is the idea of wicked problems, and the idea to think of some of the real big challenges we are facing. And I mean, climate crisis is one of them as a particular wicked problem. They're very high level, they are very interconnected, they are so complex that people don't even agree on the definition of what it is, never mind on the questions to ask or indeed the answers to those questions. Design also is very good getting students to ask open-ended questions. I have a lot of, especially undergraduate students, they want to get the answers to whatever they're wondering about. In international development or in any field, there often are no answers, definitely no easy answers. So how do you be comfortable with ambiguity, with open-endedness? Design is all about building things and working with your hands. And here's again an example from Urban Futures. Once we've done this Brighton Manifesto, we build scenarios. And this is the idea. Imagine Brighton in 2050. What do you want it to be like? And then work back from that. What are some of the things we need to build, some of the institutions? What do we need to change laws? Do we need to put different systems into place? But it's also really important for me that the students actually physically build. And I bring in all these materials, and here's kind of a photo of one of the scenarios that was created. And it reminds us of the materiality of teaching, which again often gets lost when we just discuss papers. And especially now, it's not even papers anymore, it's just screens. And there's very little, but there's something to be learned from working with your hands. And it's a very different idea of learning that I think I like to introduce the student to. It's also a good reminder of the resource politics. Different resources, different unis have different resources. So the Bolivian universities didn't even have a budget for anything like that. At Sussex we have some, I would imagine at Oxford there's a lot more budget for those kinds of activities. So what are the politics around resources? So these scenarios as an example of what that could look like in the classroom. And all this feeds into praxis. And praxis is the term I take from Paulo Freire, and a very simple definition is that practice and theory go together. So practice always needs to be informed by theoretical reflections and discussions. And that's really important in my field, coming back to international development, because we have something called white saviorism, or I actually call it expert saviorism, because it's not just race, it's gender, it's class, that are shaping students' desires, especially initially in their studies, to make the world a better place. And then again, that needs to be deconstructed. Where does this come from? How does this sit with our positionality? So this idea of wanting to do something, yes, but it needs to be critically inflected. It needs to have a theoretical basis. So that's, for me, it's this idea of applied learning or problem-focused learning, or I've come to call it learning by doing together, because it is, I think, ideally a collective process. I obviously do a lot of group work with the students. And here's an example, again, from Urban Futures, where we have a class on infrastructures. And we do a lot of kind of theoretical thinkings about infrastructures and access to infrastructures and the equality or inequality of that access. But then I go outside with the students and I say, okay, so here's Sussex campus. Let's turn it into a mini city for the next 2 hours. And let's walk across campus and map the infrastructures. Where do we see them? Where are they invisible? How do people engage with them? But I think increasingly importantly, how does the ecosystem around it engage with these? How do these infrastructures interface? And Sussex, you may or may not know, is located in the middle of a national park. So there's some really interesting dynamics around nature that are taking place. And I think the campus, and just so leaving the classroom, going outside to teach, be it Brighton, be it campus, I think is another real good opportunity. You might have heard of walking seminars. It's a different way of learning that, again, is much more creative than just kind of sitting in the classroom. So the students map these infrastructures, they come back in the classroom, and then they develop a presentation with a real focus on this is what's happening, how could this be made more sustainable? So again, kind of this very practical element, forward-looking, how can campus infrastructures be improved? So that's praxis, and then all of this together feeds into this last pedal, and that's what I call critical hope. Because I started off by saying one of the impetuses for this whole project was around students telling me that they leave the course being not very hopeful at all, or hopeless. So I thought we have to encourage our students to remain hopeful, but in a critical way. Again, it's not naive. It's not white savior, it's not kind of a fantasy or an escapism. It needs to be a hope that is very aware of its own kind of conditions of possibility, its own privilege. It needs to be backward looking and reparative in the sense of where certain, practices of injustice might have this historical precedent, but it also needs to be active in the present, and it needs to be forward looking. So there is this temporal dimension to critical hope. So what do I talk about here? I did research for this book in 2019, and if you think back, Fridays for the Future, massive climate school strikes all over the country, big ones in Brighton, and I learned from my research that they were actually all organized, the big ones in Brighton, by students in my department. So I did a lot of research with climate justice activists. But I also teach a master's level class, so in addition to my Urban Futures class, I teach a master's level class on activism for development and social change, which of course is a fantastic way to kind of implement my ideas, because the students do group work and they have to design an activism campaign. So they in a group decide the topic they want to write on, so the challenge or the problem they want to address, and then we have workshops. And it's about, again, students applying their learning about, be it prefiguration, be it unruly politics, and all these kind of quite theoretical concepts of activism, to actually, if we want to do something, how would we go about doing it? So that's a really a quite direct idea, and how do I bring this into my own teaching. And then my current project, I just want to mention, out of this research, I learned about student housing cooperatives, which is what I'm now doing. It's become my main project, because for me it's such a really interesting and powerful crystallization of students taking knowledge that they've obtained from their studies, but also outside, and addressing the problem of student housing, which is in a massive crisis in the UK, but also I've just started to look more internationally, and actually saying, you know, we want to do something about it. We are setting up these student housing cooperatives. There's one at Sussex, there's one at Edinburgh, there's one in Birmingham. There are only 3 in the UK, it's small. So I've been doing for 3 years research with these student housing cooperatives as activists, and it's really got me thinking much more about critical hope. And this is a mural from the Edinburgh Co-op. It's also incredibly creative. Co-ops are incredibly creative spaces. So with that, I think I'm almost out of time. Just want to kind of briefly finish, again coming back to what do I mean by alternatives, which is also just a way for me to really quickly run through those chapters. So when I talk about alternative responses to contemporary challenges, I do have an article on remaking academic subjectivities, because I think it needs to start with reflecting on our own positionality as educators, but also, as I said, on our students. So I introduced this idea of generative theorizing, which is basically theorizing in a way that allows alternatives to germinate and to grow, rather than kind of shutting them down with what Gibson Graham calls strong theory. It's about decentering ourselves. It's about decolonizing knowledge within the academy. I do have a chapter on reclaiming economies, where I talk about alternatives such as degrowth, diverse community and solidarity economies. And again, coming back to Gibson Graham here, who've done a lot of work in this space. And this is a really good example, this iceberg of diverse economies, where the capitalist market economy is a very small bit at the top, but underneath is an iceberg of lots of invisible practices that are auto-capitalist, that are non-capitalist, and housing cooperatives, or cooperatives in general, are part of that iceberg. So again, it's another kind of creative illustration of this. And again, so coming back to Bolivia, solidarity economies is something I read about in the Bolivian context, because it's quite strong there. Similarly, I have a chapter on ecologies, repairing ecologies, again, really, really critical. And I actually start this chapter off by deconstructing sustainable development as a very pervasive, but there's a lot you can be critical about, whether it's either sustainable or development. Lots of debates around that, but I was saying there's things like deep ecology, systems and complexity thinking that we can introduce our students to, or indeed the idea of when we were, which again is something that's coming out of indigenous thought, Bolivia, Peru, the Andes, and it's about a particular relationship that humans have with the natural world, and a very interconnected, interdependent relationship. So again, it's about decentering human and their activities in order to repair ecologies. And then last but not least, the final chapter is on prefiguring alternatives. And I do talk about, again, 2019 was a time of a lot of strikes. So I talk about strikes and teach outs that are happening around strikes as a possible alternative teaching space, because it's much more horizontal. I talk about the co-creation of knowledge in the classroom, and I talk about these examples of student activism that I have mentioned before. So I think we're good on time. So thank you so much for listening. It was a really quick summary, but again, So there is the book. Since then, I've published a number of articles that have developed particular aspects. Here's just the 3 journals where you can find that. And then there's my website, creativeuniversities.com, where there is some very practical, I have teaching resources on there, but I also have the blog where I keep updating my ideas. So I think with that one, I'll just stop here.
That was really great.
Questions?
Yes, please, do you want to come have a seat? So
yes, does that work with the camera still?
I think the camera has been coming from here.
Okay.
And so our online participants were a bit frustrated, but you were all very patient, so thank you very much, all of you. So I'm going to invite the online participants to add questions and comments in the chat, but we have a lot of people online. We also have a lot of people in the room who may well want to start the conversation off. I guess my first reflection is I'm now going to get my Lego set out and think about actually that building. That was really interesting, just the things you could do in the classroom. What I really liked about your presentation was you were thinking not just about pedagogy in a sort of institutional sense, but it was a much more broad notion of what a pedagogy would be, which would be a pedagogy that was in the world.
Yes.
Yeah. And I read that was made possible by you engaging in development studies and thinking about the urban as a space for redesign. So I thought it was really creative and really interesting. I guess my question for you, probably to get us going, would be, it does require, as you put it, a well-resourced environment, doesn't it? It requires time to think creatively about pedagogy.
Yes.
These things aren't rewarded.
Yeah.
You're not getting extra pay for this sort of thing.
Yeah.
How much time is it taking you to develop these courses and ideas?
So that's a really good question. And I guess talking about positionality, I want to acknowledge that I did this when I was further along in my career. I had a permanent position. I'm a professor now. There's a certain privilege and stability that comes with being able to do that. This has been stuff that's been with me for 20 years. But the interesting thing is, and that's about how do you sit in institutions, I did this when I was head of department. So I had an administrative role where I couldn't travel much for research, where I was thinking and talking about teaching all the time, where I had to oversee an academic review process, which went through all our teaching anyway. And I was thinking, I'm doing this anyway, I might as well turn this into something. Okay, so again, it was a position where I had some space and was thinking about this anyway, but then a particular position where I could do this as head of department. So I think the time you mention and the pressure that might be on much more junior faculty, it takes time to implement this. It takes a certain element of power that you can actually be experimental, which not everybody has. I know that from discussions with junior faculty. So yeah, absolutely. And I also this university in the world. So I mentioned Ron Burnett, but he has this beautiful image of a university, of ecological universities, which I really like, because it speaks to ecology, not just in an environmental sense, but ecology in the broader sense of being interconnected. And that's something that, has really shaped my thinking.
Interesting. No, that really makes sense. And the irony of having to have power in order to implement a very, sort of supposedly bottom-up sort of pedagogy is interesting. Can I one follow-up question is, now you're no longer head of department.
Yes. Can
you see a legacy in the course design? Is it being carried on?
Yes. I mean, it's led to writing about teaching. Again, you said it's not something that's being rewarded. I did it because it was important to me. But there's a lot more colleagues in my department who now publish on their teaching. It has become more acceptable, and that wasn't the case beforehand. The courses continue. They're very popular, I can say, but also just publishing the book. Invitation like yours, I've been invited to speak at a lot of unis who are also developing new courses. So people are engaging with it in really, really practical ways, which is really satisfying to see, because that was the whole point of doing it, in terms of, giving people ideas and inviting them to play around with that. So I'd like to think
that sounds absolutely like it has, and then it is travelling beyond Sussex, which is of course the whole point. We have got several questions in the chat, and so I'm going to ask.
Pen and paper.
Of course, yes, yeah. In theory, you should all be able to unmute and ask a question. Let's start with Lauren. Lauren, do you want to unmute and ask a question? And if you can't, then I can ask it for you.
Yeah. Yes. Sorry. Yeah, I was just curious if you could share some ideas you might.
I'll have to read it out for you.
Oh, can you not?
So Lauren asks, just curious about the scale of some of these interventions due to the constraints of our institution. Some of us are teaching classes of 390 students, which makes critical pedagogy quite difficult.
Yes, fantastic question. And that's where I want to come back to the scalability of this particular pedagogy, because as I said, it can be as small as a 10-minute exercise. And even because I've done it, I teach into a first-year class on global challenges. So even in a lecture hall, you can break for 10 minutes and say, turn to your neighbor and discuss how you might apply some of these ideas in a practical setting. So for example, in this large first year, which is I think 200 students at Sussex, we do workshop. I talk about the financial structures within international development, but then we run a workshop on universal basic income as an alternative way of funding something like that. And we are doing a whole exercise. I say to the students, imagine you are hired by an organization or have some funding, and you're to implement a universal basic income program in your in a particular place. And for an hour, the students engage with each other, and it's in a big lecture hall. And they are thinking about what are some of the questions we would be asking, who participates, how much would they get paid, how would they get paid? So again, I think there are ways to make it quite practical. If it's non-assessed, then of course it's much easier, and it's, often these small things are good beginnings, and from then it can be scaled. Yeah. But again, if you have content that takes up all of your hour or 2 hours, then I acknowledge it can be very, very difficult, even within maybe much more subject-heavy disciplines or mathematics. I don't know, my son's studying maths, how that would even begin to look like in mathematics. Yeah. But yeah, it's a really good question.
Good. Okay. Well, I hope that, Lauren, that answers your question, because I'm sorry we couldn't hear you to start with. Hopefully we can now. So the point, I guess, is that you make the most of whatever environment you've got.
Yes.
And to do.
Yes.
So another question came from Asma. Asma, can you unmute and do you want to ask your question?
Yes. Okay. Can you hear me well?
We can indeed. Yes. Sorry about that earlier, but yes, we can hear you now.
Okay. Sorry, I'm in the car right now driving. So my question is, your pedagogy, critical creative pedagogy, is this have you formulated it after doing some formal research study, or is this based on your extensive teaching experience?
Great. Okay. Thank you. That's a question, Asma.
So was it?
So does it come out of your pedagogical experience, or did it come out of a research design project?
Yeah, good question. So it's definitely comes out of my teaching experience. So this is not something that I came up with overnight, but the research project, and especially writing the book, gave me the space to actually put it in a systematic way. So the term critical creative pedagogy came to me during the research project, but it's really a kind of combination or a pulling together of what I've been doing for many years. So in a way, it's both.
It's both.
It's
that's
both.
Right. Yes.
Yeah.
And what I like about it, obviously, is obviously Freire is at the heart of this, but it's a lovely reaffirmation of Freire in a more positive sense, because Freirean pedagogy can feel as if it needs the critique before it builds.
Yes.
You know what I mean?
Yes.
So I like that.
What I like about Freire that he took his own, the first book he wrote, or one of the first books, he then, a number of years later, sat down and rewrote his book as a pedagogy of hope. And that's so beautiful,
right. Yes.
Where he looks himself very critically at his own writings and his own practice and saying, we need to be more hopeful. Mm-hmm. And here's how I did it and thought about it. And again, that was a permission to read that book, saying, okay, there is space for hope, because it takes a lot of courage to be hopeful.
Yes, yeah, no, so we must all go back and read Freire again and again. Raphael, you have a question. Do you want to unmute and ask the question?
Hello, can you hear me?
Hi. Yes, indeed.
Hi. Yeah, thank you for the interesting talk. A lot of resonance with my own research and work, which I did at KCL in London. And my PhD study was based on basically its goal was to develop a pedagogy basically that can enable the students to access knowledge about creativity. And that was very much from the ontological perspective of what creativity is for us, rather than this what you highlighted as something that we are told that creativity is in the narrow liberal context of the higher education university in which we are finding ourselves. So my question, I'll read it out now just to make sure I'm not diverting from this what I wanted to ask. So do you see your ways of teaching or doing higher education pedagogy in the context of a model, first of all? And if yes or no, can creative pedagogy actually follow or embody a model? Or is it rather very much context dependent, so specific to yourself or myself or whoever else would like to do this kind of stuff? Specifically the person, environment, place, time, etc.
Thank you. That's a good question. So I don't think I set out to create a model, but I did want to obviously present a more systematic thinking. I think critical creative pedagogy for me is a practice. I would call it more of a practice. And the book is very much written as an invitation. So I was almost like, here's what I've been doing. Here's what my colleagues have been doing. Here's how our students feel about it. I invite you to think about how this might work in your own context. So it's definitely context specific, because we all teach in different institutional, disciplinary contexts. Again, personal positionality plays in there. But I would like to think that, yes, the idea of the pedagogy as such and the different aspects of it and the scalability would make it more broadly applicable. But what that looks like, I'm not saying this is how you have to teach, absolutely not. Although I do acknowledge that there is a politics and an ethics in the way I write, because I think there's value in this way of teaching. But in terms of what that might look like, that's very, very context specific.
Yeah, that's interesting. Thank you for the answer, because while I was aiming a model initially, there was this inconvenient realist truth that emerged. Actually, it is, and that's why I didn't want to say it before. I want to hear it from you first, that it is actually very much context dependent and actually personal. It very much comes to your own worldview and your way of seeing, of being, also in the classroom as a teacher, and not hardly reproducible. Which, in the context of the scientific method and any method, of course, it's an issue. Thank you for that.
Yeah, and maybe just so I can add to that. So it's been interesting then getting invitations from other unis who are saying, we are building a uni-wide or a department-wide context course around sustainability, and we like critical creative pedagogy, and we want you to come in and help us think through what that would look like. And then I'm saying, there are other institutional contexts where this resonates, and then I'm learning through those discussions as well, what are the particular kind of constraints and opportunities there. So it is transferable to some extent, but then what it looks like is always really specific.
Yeah. Good. Thank you very much, Raphael. That's really, really helpful.
Thank you for the answer.
Yeah. So a couple more questions online, and then we'll turn to the room if that's okay. Unless anyone in the room wants to immediately ask a question, do put your hands up. So Liv, you asked a question about personal experiences. Would you like to ask that question now?
Yes.
Thank you. Hi.
Thank you. I'm right now. I'm studying the PhD study. So the topic is about to explore transnational educator development, because the institution I'm working for, the people from different countries, from the local Chinese and from British, from South African. So people we are working here have different education background. So how do you have any experiences relating to transnational education, or how to refer this to the critical pedagogy?
Yes, thank you for this question. So my experience with kind of the international or transnational element is through my own, especially the master's students who are very, very international. So when I teach on activism, I'm very aware of that it means different things to different people in different contexts. Being an activist in China, for example, would look very, very different to being an activist in the UK or Germany. But then also this class I mentioned that I've gotten in more recently involved, which is for a master's in education, which again, very international. And doing this class on embodied teaching and working with students from very different cultural backgrounds and how they are comfortable using their own bodies in the classroom and working with their own bodies. And I say I'm working with a wonderful colleague who's a drama teacher and who can facilitate that. But I think it's definitely a really important, so the cultural element, so both in terms of, you know, how we think about education, our own educational experiences, but then also, let's call it the political culture within what's actually possible to do is something that, you know, can be explored much more. And as I said, it's very much anchored in the UK, my research, and then a little bit of Bolivia. So I think that's a really interesting area to look more into how this would translate into other international academic contexts that I haven't done so enough so far.
Good. I hope that answers your question, and thank you very much for that. Lauren, you've been kind enough to offer a second thought. Now that we've got the speakers working, would you like to ask your question as well?
Yes, is it working?
It is indeed, yes. Sorry again.
Okay, great. No problem. Yeah, I just wanted to kind of pick up on something you mentioned earlier about the ecology of the university. And I have, at the university that I work at, we're really struggling to kind of reestablish a sense of community amongst staff. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts about how this approach might help to also create a more creative university for staff and not just students, like something about the fostering of community and relationship.
Yes, thank you. It's a fantastic question. And my first thing would be to say, like, you can't do it alone. So even though this came out of my individual teaching practice, but I only started to put it all together in this way when I realized I'm not the only one who gets these reactions from students. And I'm not the only one who is thinking that we need to do something to address these reactions. And I'm also not the only one who thinks about creativity and creative teaching. So I'm very lucky to be in a department where a lot of people are having the same interest. And I think so it's really important to find those kind of like-minded colleagues for support. But then I think also it can be really enriching. It can give, you know, space to enriching discussions around pedagogy that, as I said, are often sidelined because teaching is just something we do, right? And if it doesn't fit into our research, we often don't have time to discuss it or to write about it. But also, I think being more creative, I think, can also just contribute to kind of just having nicer discussion. Now, I've also said it's fun, right? And there's nothing wrong with maybe making teaching more fun. It's fun for students, but it can also be fun having a teaching away day, using some of these exercises. So yeah, I would hope that there is also scope to contribute to a different kind of relationships amongst staff as educators, as committed educators.
What interests me about everything you said is you are doing this from the context of your long teaching experience and really informed by your thinking about the literature. You're not coming at it out of an academic development lens.
Yes.
And so often discussions around teaching are led from a sort of frame of this is the academic development perspective, yes, which alienates some academics. Yes. And you know, I think we're all to blame sometimes because we don't think enough about the importance of giving time to teaching, it becomes a private thing. It becomes something which, you know, you're not rewarded for. But you're absolutely right that actually, if you have a conversation about teaching that's well facilitated by people, then it would actually bring people together and engage people. So that's really interesting.
And at Sussex, I do work with our PG Cert people, and I give workshops every year and with our PhD tutors. So there's that connection as well. But yeah, that's not how it started off at all, and that's not the primary aim.
That's right. Yes, We've used most of the questions that come online, so I don't know if anyone in the room would like to add a comment or thought or reflection. Yes.
Could I just would like to sort of expand on this a little bit, as far as in a world with ever-increasing wicked problems and also universities dealing with wicked problems, and Anke and I sort of connection started with teaching at UC Berkeley, and an interdisciplinary program that was situated at the School of Information, but drew on many of the other schools around there. And this idea of how do you break down the silos, and also how active this has become now in particularly the big universities, MIT, Berkeley, Stanford, with the D-School and design thinking as almost sort of a slightly separate but connective hub from the silos to the D-School, which often gets the most favorable responses from exiting students as the course they enjoyed the most and worked with the most number of sort of interdisciplinary programs and so on. So I just would like you to sort of maybe expand a little bit on this with design thinking and those sort of moving forward, like how this could be engaged in universities, whether sort of Oxford, Sussex. Because it often requires also a lot of money to be invested.
That's the resources. So I don't know, as the dimension here is, so Stanford University, it's a very wealthy university in California, has something called the D-School, which is, if we ever have a chance to go there, it's a beautiful space. It's fantastic. The materials the students have. There's an equivalent in Potsdam in Germany, which we just visited, which is also very well endowed. So the resource politics. But I think this question of interdisciplinarity is a really interesting one, because I think this pedagogy at its best pulls together and allows for interdisciplinary or indeed, maybe even transdisciplinary teaching. And I think the thing of sustainability is such a good example, because so many unis are now moving in that direction, and also in terms of having new courses, new programs, and sustainability in relation to all the climate challenges is a wicked problem, and that needs looking at from lots of different elements, including the systems thinking, the design. So allowing for this interdisciplinarity by not being attached to a particular discipline, I think is really important. And it's been interesting to see that most of the stuff that I've been invited to speak has come in that interdisciplinary context. So it's a really good point.
Well, the design thinking part of that kind of helps unify the pieces.
Definitely,
We need a D-School here, I think. That's really helpful. Thank you very much. Did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, thank you so much. So I teach classes in Anthropology of Education. And I think one of the issues that we have is that some of the students we have come from a teacher training kind of background, and a very normative, very kind of hands-on, problem solving, really want to do something here and now, while we want to create a slightly different space for reflexivity and perhaps also for a bit more slow science, slow kind of, and I'm wondering how do these methods kind of fit into that problematic to not end up being like really short-term problem solving focus playgrounds, but actually allowing students to engage in a different way, where the normative aspects and problem solving aspects is not like the here and now.
No, absolutely. And I recognize that in international development, a lot of students are coming and saying, we want to know how to do international development, how it works. And it's really frustrating when they sit in a classroom and say, I'm not going to tell you how it works. I'm actually going to tell you that a lot of the things you're thinking are probably not going to work. And there's somebody called Wendy Harcourt who writes beautifully about that. it can be frustrating, and I think it can be frustrating to students who are not used to that kind of learning, or who don't necessarily, that's not what they came for. So I think really important is to acknowledge that it's a different way of teaching and learning. And I always also really interesting to explain why I'm doing what I'm doing. Like, why do I do this kind of teaching? It's a form of pedagogy. There's something to be learned, even though it's like, it's not banking education. It's not, right? I'm not going to fill your head with facts and this. So
it could tip into that kind of using the space for engaging the really kind of short-term problems, some of them.
Yes. So it's really interesting. I never talk about solutions. I don't like that word. I think it's often short term. It's technical fixes. This belief in certain solutions has actually created the challenges. So I always talk about responses. I think it's a much more gradual, a much slower process that needs much more critical reflexivity. In ID, we talk a lot about this band-aid solutions, right? That are not working. So again, yes, acknowledging that, and but I always think, coming back to like explaining, why am I teaching this way? What do I think you can learn from that? And then saying this is an invitation, and for most of my students, the idea of, we get all this theoretical knowledge. What to do with this knowledge? Being given an opportunity within the classroom to think, how can I actually apply that? And for example, the activism ones, I let the students pick their own campaigns. I don't say you have to do a campaign on that. And even how the students work out what to focus their campaign on, because in that process, they're identifying what's important to us collectively. And I think right there is a way of making it personal that then I think resonates more, where students are recognizing, yeah, this is relevant to us, this way of learning, even though it's different from what we maybe wanted or expected. And then yes, it's not short-term fixes. That needs to be, I think, made really explicit in the readings, in the theoretical discussions. This only goes together with theory, right? This is critical creative. The critical part is really, really important. This is all embedded within a kind of a theoretical scaffolding where students read. We do discuss theorists, we do discuss readings. So that part's not falling away. Would like to think I'm enriching it. That answers the question.
Christine.
You mentioned, I think, that you work with undergraduate,
yes,
possibly first-year students and also postgraduates. First-year undergrads, of course, can be naively enthusiastic and open to things. But being a student's really only a temporary identity.
yes.
So what's your experience of students where maybe their other identities are becoming more important to them again, particularly in maybe their final year?
Yes, so I think a couple of answers. I think when they talk about experiential learning, that is very much a way to acknowledge that students have a life outside university, and I think about how those experiences are a form of knowledge. Bring those in. It's peer learning. It really enriches students learning from each other, and I learn as much, especially on the master's level. I learn as much from my students as they learn from me, because I think, and again, class on activism, how does activism work in your own country? We talk a lot about the possibility of being an activist within the academy, which is really interesting. The third-year students, and that's about, I need to get a job, right? And so this is really important. And I'm very critical of the neoliberal education system, and my chapter on producing alternatives, where I talk about activism, I start off with deconstructing the whole employability term. But I'm not saying employability isn't important. Of course it is. Students need to write, not least of all because of student debt and something. The students need to go out and find jobs and this element of work. But I think we need to think about employability much less instrumental in a much more critical sense. So, but that becomes really important. But that's actually, so for me, it's with the urban futures, it's really interesting when students then saying, oh, you know, I'm now doing a master's in urban studies, or I've gotten a job in like a local planning department, and that's directly because of the teaching we got in your class. So that's, when I get these emails, it's absolutely lovely, because I see, oh, what I'm trying to do is working, because they've become much more interested in urban issues, but also they have, even through my teaching, where, you know, I do talk about employability because we have to now, it has to be embedded and it has to be on the website, but I don't, for me, it's much more, how can you apply what you're learning in the classroom to situations that you want to change, and that can be very much in a workplace. And it resonates with students, it works. So, but absolutely, with third years, that's really interesting, because that anxiety, but also that sense of possibility, now I'm graduating, where do I go from here? And I think that's where this learning by doing becomes almost even more important, because they are leaving uni and going on to other things, and want to feel prepared for that. Yeah.
Brilliant. We're come to the end of our online hour, so I'm going to say thank you all very much for coming online and for being patient and for our forbearance dealing with the slight technical challenges. I think you've left, certainly me, Anke, with a thought that if you were in a neoliberal mindset, you have a wonderful package to sell to many universities, but I know you're not. That's not your agenda, and I think that makes it even more powerful in that you're offering something which is genuinely intentional and purposeful. So thank you all for coming, and we'll post the slides tomorrow and the recording as well. And do come again to every Tuesday afternoon at 2 p.m. UK time for our seminars. Thank you. Bye-bye.